John Baptiste, also known as Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Savoie, was half black and half French. He was originally from Haiti. He arrived in Chicago around 1790 and became the first resident. He lived by the Chicago River and operated the only farm in the area. He was a British and Indian sympathizer who married a Potawatomi woman, and they had 2 children. In 1800, Baptiste moved west. John Kinsey. In 1802, John Kinsey moved with his wife and children to Chicago and became the first European residents of the city. Kinsey competed with Ebenezer Bennett for the position of the first government trader. He became the civilian leader and performed duties such as the occasional slave trade, marriages, trading expedition, etc. He was also involved in arguments between military officers at Fort Dearborn about natives receiving alcohol. In 1810, Kinsey had the fort's captain, Captain Whistler, removed, marking the first known use of political clout in the city. He was also responsible for the death of Jean Lalim, which was Chicago's first murder. After fleeing to Wisconsin, he was exonerated by Dearborn officials. James Thompson. In 1830, he was hired by the Illinois and Michigan Canal Commissioners to survey Randolph Country in order to create Chicago's first plat. He laid out the city's grid system for the Canal Commissioners so that lots could be sold to fund the Illinois and Michigan Canal. The Native Americans left in 1833 due to the Second Treaty of Chicago. The U.S. government sent an Indian agent, James V. Owen, William Weatherford, and the governor of Michigan, George B. Porter. The native tribes they met with were the Potawatomi, Chippewa, and Ottawa. The commissioners offered the natives food, whiskey, and more. They eventually agreed that the U.S. gets all land west of Lake Michigan to Lake Winnebago in Wisconsin. In return, the natives get various cash payments and the land west of Mississippi. In 1836, a committee was formed to apply state legislature for a city charter. Chicago was ideally suited to take advantage of the trading possibilities available due to westward expansion. In 1837, Chicago became a city. At the time, it had around 4,170 residents, and the first mayor was William B. Ogden.
A visionary businessman who became Chicago's first mayor, William Butler Ogden helped to write the city charter, oversaw construction of nearly 100 miles of city streets, and built Chicago's first railroad. Like many early settlers, Ogden was a Yankee. He came to Chicago when it was still a frontier village surrounded by swamp and prairie. Within a few years, Ogden made a fortune in real estate and as an owner of a brewery and other businesses. He was elected mayor during the Panic of 1837. Although the country plunged into a recession, Ogden kept the city solvent and persuaded Eastern investors to maintain faith in the young city. Leaving office, Ogden turned his attention to transportation. In 1848, he built the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad to link the prosperous mining town of Galena in western Illinois to Chicago. When Eastern investors proved skeptical, an undeterred Ogden financed the line by selling shares to farmers and merchants along the route. Ogden's energetic leadership helped Chicago become the railroad capital of the nation and led to the city's tremendous growth. The Panic of 1837 almost had a detrimental effect on the young city of Chicago. Handicapped by national debt in the most recent compromise tariff bill of 1833, Andrew Jackson responded in 1836 with the Specie Circular. The expected increase of flow of gold and silver to the national treasury was met by a plummeting of a quarter of the land sales, failing of 250 business houses in New York, and on May 10, 1837, suspension of specie in every bank in New York. Although there are many different positions on what caused the economic crisis, Chicago was very negatively impacted. Because Chicago's main commodity was trade, the Chicago economy plummeted, which in turn stopped work on the canal. Ogden weathered the storm, and thankfully the construction began again. In 1848, the Illinois and Michigan Canal was opened in Chicago. It took Irish workers 11 years to build this monumental impact on the waterways in the United States. Since the beginning of settlement in Chicago, the canal has been envisioned as a tie to greatness. Connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River was a huge goal for many investors in the Chicago area as well as in the East. This canal ensured that products from New York could make their way through Chicago and down to New Orleans. The canal also brought many Irish into Chicago and created an ethnic neighborhood named Bridgeport. Though the I&M Canal was highly anticipated, it was slightly upstaged by the railroad system. The first railroad constructed out of Chicago, the Galena-Chicago Union, was chartered on January 16, 1836, to connect Chicago with the lead lines at Galena. The Pioneer, the first locomotive on the road, arrived at Chicago on October 10, 1848, nearly 13 years after the charter was granted. In 1850, the Galena-Chicago Union Railroad was completed as far as Elgin. Railroad and canal were vital in the development of Chicago, and the population of the city tripled in the 6 years after the opening of the canal. Eventually, other railroads were built, and Chicago became the largest railroad center in the world. In 1862, the GNCU leased in perpetuity the ceded rights and Missouri Railroad, which was to be the first railroad to reach Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the first transcontinental railroad. The GNCU consolidated with the Chicago and Northern Western Railway in 1864, which merged with the Union Pacific Railroad, or a century later in 1996. Today, the GNCU's main line between Chicago and West Chicago is a busy commuter service, jointly operated by Union Pacific and Metra as the Union Pacific West Line. The first westbound train out of Chicago departed on October 25, 1848, pulled up by a used Baldwin-built locomotive named Pioneer. The Chicago Board of Trade, CBOT, established in 1848, is the world's oldest futures and options exchange. Founded to promote and monitor Chicago commerce, the Chicago Board of Trade started with 82 members and no special interest in the grain business. The city's grain traders and merchants had no special interest in the Board of Trade either. In the early days, the board lured members with free lunches. Even that was not sufficient inducement. On 4 days in July 1851, the only one member showed up, and no one showed up on 4 other days. Traders preferred to do business on the city streets amid mounds of wheat and oats. Along with transportation developments this year, the beginning of the modern Chicago we enjoy today started here.